Katie Morag and the New Pier by Mairi Hedderwick. Here's a map of the Isle of Strewy. For months, workmen had been building a new pier on the Isle of Strewy. They were a cheery lot and lived in huts by the shore. They only complained when the weather got too bad to get on with the work. They felt homesick for their families and friends on the mainland. They looked forward to the day the new pier would be finished. So did the islanders. Katie Morag was especially excited about the new pier. The boat will be able to come to Strewy 3 times a week instead of 1, said her father, Mr. McColl, the shopkeeper. Mrs. McColl, the postmistress, was delighted. She would have lots more mail deliveries to do. Grandma Mainland will be able to come more often, said Neely Beag. And she'll be able to get away quicker, said Granny Island, who was not very sure about the new pier, but saw that it had some advantages. But for the most part, Granny Island was pessimistic. The old ways will be forgotten, she frowned. The place will get too busy. There'll be no more jaunts out in the ferry boat to the big boat in the bay. Granny Island often manned the ferry boat on the days that the ferryman was ill or on holiday. I'll miss that, and so will you, Katie Morag. And what will the ferryman do for a living? Katie Morag hadn't thought about all that. In the village, people were saying it was time the old ways changed. They started to paint their windows and gates bright colours and tidy their gardens. Mrs. Baxter said she was going to open up a craft shop. The lady artist, of course, was already making interesting things to sell in it. On the other side of the bay, Mr. McMaster, the farmer, was very pleased. I'll be able to send off eggs, milk and cheese to the mainland 3 times a week. Ark, well, sighed the ferryman. I suppose I'll soon be redundant. What does that mean? Asked Katie Morag. No longer wanted, replied the ferryman, as he and Katie Morag walked along the shore. Katie Morag nearly tripped over a large blue, neatly coiled rope on the tide line. Finders keepers, said the ferryman. That's the rule of the sea when something is washed up by the tide. Oh no, I'll give it to the ferry boat, declared Katie Morag. Have you been having chocolate cake again? Asked Mrs. McColl crossly as Katie Morag toyed with her tea that night. She had, but it wasn't the cake that was making Katie Morag sad. She tried to tell Mr. and Mrs. McColl all about the ferryman, but her parents were not listening. The pier will be finished by spring, weather permitting, said Mrs. McColl, looking at the calendar. Spring came, but it did not come alone. It was accompanied by fearsome storms. One especially wet and windy day, the foreman on the pier told the men to tie down the equipment and stop work. It was boring sitting in the huts waiting for the wild weather to end, so the workmen visited the islanders and sat by their cosy fires and told stories about life on the mainland. Jimmy and George were in the McColl's kitchen when the foreman burst in. The huts are floating out to sea, he shouted. Everyone rushed to the door, and sure enough, there was the new pier awash, but not a hut in sight, save the one that bobbed and bucked in the bay. The rest had all sunk. There was something else bobbing in the bay. It was the ferry boat. Katie Morag could just make out the ferryman throwing a rope over the handle of the hut door. But as Granny Island steered the ferry boat alongside, a huge wave lifted the rope off the handle and the hut started to drift out to sea again. Use my rope, shouted Katie Morag at the top of her voice. Granny Island revved the boat close to the hut again, and she circled round it. So went the strong blue rope. Everyone cheered as the ferry boat towed the hut to shore. What seamanship, said the workman. What a rope, said the ferryman, smiling at Katie Morag as he stepped out of the boat. You can't sleep in that, said the islanders as sodden mattresses and broken bits of furniture fell out of the hut door. You will just have to stay with us until the new pier is finished. Great, thought Katie Morag. Mainland stories every night. Next morning the storm had subsided and the men went back to work. The foreman said the ferryman could keep the hut for firewood. He and the men thought it was just fine staying in the islanders' homes, much more comfortable than the huts. Each workman boasted that his lodgings were the best, but everyone had to agree that the ferryman's wife's chocolate cake was quite the most fabby-do. It was Easter, and the new pier was finally completed. The boat came alongside laden with important people and visitors, and there was Grandma Mainland. The workmen shook hands with the islanders and said they would be back for their holidays. Nearly everyone wanted to book in at the ferryman's house, and Katie Morag knew why. That's it then, sighed Granny Island as hordes of visitors meandered towards the village. The end of the ferry boat and the old ways. No, it's not, said Katie Morag, taking her two grandmothers over to the ferryman's house. The hut was transformed. Inside, a counter displayed several chocolate cakes and pots of tea. Grandma Mainland was first in the queue. After the visitors have had their tea, you and I and Katie Morag can take them out for a jaunt in the ferry boat, Granny Island, suggested the ferryman. And you can tell them all about the old ways, said Katie Morag. Granny Island smiled. The new pier was not going to be such a bad thing after all.